The Assistant Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police has admitted that the force made mistakes when policing pro-Palestine protests, particularly in the early stages.
Well, speaking to the think tank Policy Exchange, Matt Twist cited the decision to not immediately arrest demonstrators shouting jihad as an example of the Met not acting decisively enough during the protests.
Well, however, he did insist police tactics had since developed, and he strongly rejected any accusation of two-tier or differential policing.
Well, delighted to be joined now in the studio by the former Scotland Yard detective, Peter Bleksley. Peter, have the police finally admitted what a lot of people could see for a long time, that too often they would simply stand on the sidelines and watch what many people would see as unacceptable behaviour go without challenge?
Yes, I think they absolutely have, particularly, as Assistant Commissioner Matt Twist admits, with regards to jihad. Let's just rewind those few short months to October of last year, and the police were saying, ludicrously, that jihad can actually mean a spiritual striving against moral failings. That's how it can be interpreted, and yet there were people with hatred written all over their faces, chanting for it, clearly wishing death and genocide upon a whole range of people. It was ludicrous that they weren't more forceful, but this, unfortunately, is what you've got with this current breed of senior police leaders who actually think that policing is a popularity contest and we must curry favour as much as we possibly can, where, of course, that's sheer, utter nonsense. They lack experience, they've risen without trace, they don't have operational grip, and consequently, this is the policing that we get.
Peter, you mentioned the chanting of jihad. That, if I remember correctly, was a Hizb ut-Tahrir protest, which was on the sidelines of the mass pro-Palestine protest. And I understand that they decided that there was no offence at all. I believe they spoke to one of the people chanting and, discouraged them from doing it again.
Spiritual striving against moral failings. I mean, it's laughable that they didn't go in there and make arrests at the time. But this, unfortunately, is what we've seen. OK, let's take this admission at face value. It's a positive sign if they're going to learn from it. But, of course, we know in very recent times, look at how the riots were quite rightly quelled by the mobilisation almost instantaneously of 6,000 police officers countrywide. Let's rewind just a few days to the Notting Hill Carnival. The Metropolitan Police, 7,000 officers ready and mobilised for that event. If there's the political will and there's the policing will, so many of the ills that blight this once great nation could be addressed. It's just a case of will they?
It's such an interesting point, because this isn't, of course, to say that everyone on these protests were worthy of arrest. There were many good people who went on these protests who perhaps didn't see or were in different bits of where the troublemakers were. But let's not beat around the bush. There were troublemakers there. There were people chanting genocidal slogans. There were people getting away with things that you wouldn't expect on the streets of Britain. Do you think that the police will learn from this now?
I sincerely hope so. I'm going to give some credit now for the policing of the protests at this weekend that's just gone. There were only 8 arrests, 6 from the pro-Palestinian side and 2 counter-protesters. So in terms of the planning, the prep and largely keeping people separated, they did a very competent job. But it's not so long ago that a man with a red football shirt was walking down Oxford Street with Hamas on the back and the number 7. That man has still not been arrested. And I say to the Metropolitan Police, well, why not?
It's quite interesting how our police decided, well, and our government, our politicians, Mayor of London, etc., how they chose to police, because other countries in Europe just decided to blanket ban these types of protests. I believe France had pretty much a zero tolerance after the first 2 or 3. I'm sure they're still going on in smaller numbers, but they did try to completely stop them. Would that have been the right approach, or would that have been too much of an attack on our basic rights to protest?
Well, the police will always say that they will protect the right to protest, and I think, of course, that's the absolute right position to adopt. But we've had 18 of these now, and this report published today has told us what so many of us knew already, and that there is a significant impact on businesses, from shops to restaurants to bars to any other kind of entertainment business in central London, because people in substantial numbers, when these marches are on, are just going, do you know what? I'm not going to London. I'm not going to spend my money, and the economy is being affected.
Oh, you can see that in central London, Regent Street and Oxford Street, empty sometimes.
Yeah, absolutely.
Feels empty, apart from the socialist worker placards and the like.
Indeed, and we have a government that's promising growth and talking about growth almost endlessly. Well, that's not going to happen if huge swathes of our capital city are regarded as a no-go area by people who simply don't want to run the risk of getting caught up in these protests.
Well, Peter Bleksley, former Met detective, really appreciate your thoughts on this issue. No doubt it won't be the last that we hear of the Metropolitan Police and how they approach these protests.
Yeah, actor and campaigner Idris Elba, he's joined the Prime Minister in Downing Street this morning to launch a new effort to tackle knife crime.
Well, he's highlighting a coalition which will aim to bring together campaign groups, families of people who've lost their lives to knife crime, and young people who's been affected by it.
Now, ministers have already taken steps to ban so-called ninja swords and plan to strengthen the laws around the online sales of knives. So how might this go? What more can they do?
Well, joining us from Westminster is our political correspondent, Olivia Utley. Now, Olivia, is anything concrete coming from this, or is this just another talking shop?
It does seem to be more of a conversation than any new policy announcement. It's actually very similar to what we saw on Friday when Yvette Cooper met at the National Crime Association with all sorts of representatives from the CPS, etc. And again, there was very, very little actual concrete policy information coming out of this. This meeting, it seems, was pushed by Idris Elba, knife crime campaigner, who's pushing together a coalition of people from youth workers to police officers to politicians to try and stop people getting into knife crime in the first place. Let's have a listen to what the actor had to say.
Today was identify some of the low-hanging fruit that can be actioned quickly, right? Things around, accessibility on knives, online sales and things like that. These things take time to actually get into law, but today was really about how do we get to them quicker. And so our next step is to aggregate the thoughts that we've had today. We've got a point of contact, and that person will be aggregating those action points, and then those involved in those action points will be then tasked to get them done. The Prime Minister, by the way, is just super keen to just keep pushing, and that's what we've seen, so it's been good.
So a lot of aggregating action points there from this group, this coalition of workers, not very much concrete policy. One thing that Keir Starmer is doing is getting a review into gaps in legislation around zombie knives. Zombie knives have been outlawed, but there is a lot of concern that zombie knife owners are finding ways around that legislation. In fact, zombie knives were first outlawed almost 10 years ago, and again, these criminals have found ways around that legislation. So it is possible that that legislation might just be tightened up a little, but that's the only really policy development that we have.
Yes, Olivia, I mean, tightening online sales of these horrific knives is, I guess, a good thing to do. People shouldn't be able to go onto Amazon and buy a zombie knife or a ninja knife or a machete. But it's not going to stop people from carrying, a standard kitchen knife and doing damage with that. We've seen so many stabbings across the country where it's just something that you could take from your kitchen.
Well, absolutely. And ultimately, this is what is so difficult for every government about tackling the knife crime problem. Obviously, you cannot outlaw the ownership of knives. People need knives for legitimate reasons in their day-to-day life, which is why Idris Elba and knife crime campaigners like him are trying to go down the social route rather than purely the legislative route, trying to stop people getting into knife crime in the first place. But of course, that is easier said said than done, particularly in an age of social media. We say it again and again, but it is worth saying because it is very true. There's all sorts of influences coming in from young people, from all sorts of varied sources. One element is perhaps holding social media companies to account. That's something, again, that Idris Elba has been talking about with the Prime Minister this morning. But again, easier said than done. We've seen what happens when the law tries to regulate social media companies. It just doesn't tend to work that well. These companies are so much bigger than British legislation at the end of the day.
And when people start talking about social media when it comes to knife crime, I always just think, hang on, was there no knife crime before around 2010? I mean, this was
always social media.
It was a huge problem in the 90s, and then it sort of decreased a bit, and now it's been on the increase again. I don't think it's necessarily so, but the government just always wants to find what it can try and regulate.
It's a bogeyman, isn't it? Oh, if Elon Musk regulates Twitter a little more,
then people...
we'll all be safe.
It's like when David Amess, the MP, so David Amess was murdered by an Islamist terrorist, and then everyone started talking about anonymity on Twitter. I mean, the guy didn't even have Twitter who killed him.
Well, exactly.
Olivia, I suppose people, to some extent, want to be seen to be doing something. But there is also a risk to that, in that if they pass a lot more laws, ban a lot more knives, and this still keeps on happening, the government might look fairly impotent.
Well, exactly. And I mean, there is a very good argument to make that all of the laws are already in place to prevent knife crime taking place. It is clearly illegal to stab somebody with a knife. And it does sometimes feel as though, in wanting to look as though it's doing something about this terrible, terrible scourge, the government adds in increasingly complex legislation which makes life more difficult for police officers and doesn't actually change the results on knife crime that much, which of course is why people like Idris Elba and knife crime campaigners try and tackle the problem from a different angle, the social angle, trying to stop people wanting to get into knife crime in the first place. And so then you get into conversations about youth groups, social media as well, etc. But again, it all feels pretty small in relation to this absolutely enormous problem.